Nearly 30 years without answers. The JonBenét Ramsey murder case. Snow had settled across Boulder, Colorado, in the early hours of December 26, 1996. Inside one of the city's most recognizable homes, what began as the morning after Christmas quickly transformed into one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. Before sunrise, Patsy Ramsey reported that her 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, was missing. A lengthy handwritten ransom note had been found on the staircase inside the family home. It demanded $118,000 and warned the family not to contact police. Within minutes, officers arrived. Friends gathered at the house to comfort the Ramseys. Detectives began treating the situation as a kidnapping, but the evidence inside the home told an increasingly complicated story. Just hours later, John Ramsey searched the basement of the house with a family friend after being asked by detectives to check the residence once again. Behind a latched door in a little-used basement room, he found JonBenét's body. The investigation changed forever. What had started as a kidnapping had become a homicide investigation. Nearly 3 decades later, no one has been convicted of JonBenét Ramsey's murder. The case has generated thousands of investigative leads, extensive forensic testing, multiple grand jury proceedings, national media attention, and continuing debate. Yet despite advances in DNA technology and years of investigation, the person responsible has never been identified in court. This is not simply the story of one of America's most famous cold cases. It is the story of a little girl whose name became known around the world before investigators could answer the most important question of all. What happened inside that Boulder home on Christmas night? Before we go further, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Someone watching may remember another case that has never been solved, and every shared story helps keep forgotten victims remembered. Long before television crews surrounded the Ramsey home, JonBenét was simply a little girl enjoying childhood. She was born on August 6, 1990, in Atlanta, Georgia, to John and Patsy Ramsey. John was a successful businessman whose software company had experienced significant growth during the 1990s. Patsy, a former beauty queen, devoted much of her time to raising the couple's children and supporting community activities. JonBenét grew up with her older brother, Burke, while John also had children from a previous marriage. Friends described JonBenét as energetic, outgoing, and affectionate. She enjoyed dancing, singing, and spending time with her family. She also participated in children's beauty pageants, something that would later become one of the most publicly discussed aspects of her life. Photographs from those competitions became familiar across television screens worldwide. But it's important to remember that pageants represented only one part of JonBenét's childhood. She attended school, celebrated birthdays, played with friends, and looked forward to holidays like countless other 6-year-olds. Christmas was especially exciting. The Ramsey family decorated their home, exchanged presents, and prepared to celebrate with relatives. No one could have imagined that the holiday would become forever associated with tragedy. On Christmas Day 1996, the family attended a gathering at the home of friends before returning to their residence later that evening. According to statements given during the investigation, JonBenét fell asleep during the drive home. John later carried her upstairs to bed. It would be the last night anyone recalled seeing her alive. Now that you've gotten to know who JonBenét Ramsey was, does her story remind you why every victim deserves to be remembered as a person first? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Keeping JonBenét's memory human keeps cases like this alive. During the early morning hours of December 26, Patsy Ramsey said she woke to prepare for the family's planned trip to Michigan. As she descended the staircase, she discovered several handwritten pages lying on the steps. The note claimed JonBenét had been kidnapped by what it described as a small foreign faction. It demanded exactly $118,000 for her safe return. Investigators would later note that this amount closely matched John's recent work bonus, a detail that became one of many unusual aspects of the case. The note instructed the family not to contact police. Instead, Patsy immediately called 911. That emergency call, placed shortly before 6 o'clock that morning, marked the official beginning of one of the largest homicide investigations in Colorado history. Officers arrived quickly. Initially, investigators approached the scene as a kidnapping. The house, however, was never completely secured. Friends, family acquaintances, and a minister were invited inside to comfort the Ramseys. Looking back, investigators have acknowledged that this complicated the preservation of potential evidence. As the morning progressed, hours passed without the expected ransom call described in the note. Detectives became increasingly concerned. By early afternoon, Detective Linda Arndt asked John Ramsey and family friend Fleet White to search the house again, beginning from the top floor and working downward. John eventually opened the door to a small basement room. Inside, he found JonBenét. She had been dead for several hours. John immediately carried his daughter upstairs. Although his actions reflected the instinct of a grieving father, investigators later recognized that moving the body altered the original crime scene. From that moment forward, the case ceased to be a kidnapping investigation. It became a homicide. The questions multiplied almost immediately. If JonBenét had never left the house, who wrote the ransom note? Why stage a kidnapping? How had no one heard anything during the night? And who was responsible? Those questions would define the investigation for decades. Medical examiners later determined that JonBenét died from asphyxia associated with a head injury. Authorities also documented evidence indicating she had experienced sexual assault. Beyond those established forensic findings, investigators have publicly withheld certain details, a common practice intended to preserve the integrity of an ongoing homicide investigation. By the end of December 26, Boulder had become the focus of international media attention. Reporters filled neighborhood streets. Television helicopters circled overhead. What had begun as a family tragedy quickly became a national story. But behind every headline was a 6-year-old child whose family, and investigators, were still searching for answers. The investigation was only beginning. And before detectives could determine who was responsible, they first had to understand everything that had happened inside the Ramsey home during the final hours of Christmas night. Detectives now faced a case unlike any they had expected that morning. Every homicide investigation begins with the same fundamental questions. Who was the victim? Who had access? What evidence remains? And perhaps most importantly, what does the scene itself reveal? In the Ramsey home, the answers were anything but straightforward. The investigation was divided almost immediately into two competing possibilities. Either someone had entered the house during the night, committed the crime, and left behind a ransom note, or the events that morning were connected to someone already inside the home. From the very beginning, investigators had to consider every possibility. That included the Ramseys themselves. It also included the possibility of an unknown intruder. Publicly, the Boulder Police Department has consistently stated that both theories were investigated. No one was ever charged. No one was ever convicted. The evidence would have to speak for itself. One of the earliest questions centered on the ransom note. At nearly 3 handwritten pages, it was unusually long compared with most ransom demands. Investigators determined that the note had been written on paper belonging to the Ramsey household. The pen used to write it also came from inside the home. According to forensic examinations, the author appeared to have returned the pen and notepad after writing the message. That discovery immediately raised difficult questions. If an intruder wrote the note, they would have spent a considerable amount of time inside the house before leaving. If someone inside the home wrote it, investigators would need evidence proving exactly who. Handwriting experts were brought in. Multiple specialists examined writing samples from Patsy Ramsey, John Ramsey, and others connected to the case. The conclusions, however, were not unanimous. Some experts believed Patsy Ramsey could not be eliminated as the writer. Others concluded the evidence was insufficient to identify any author conclusively. To this day, no forensic handwriting examination has definitively identified who wrote the ransom note. That uncertainty became one of the defining features of the case. Investigators also examined the basement where JonBenét's body had been found. The room was small, isolated, and located behind a latched wooden door. Because John Ramsey had carried JonBenét upstairs after discovering her, the original crime scene had been altered before forensic investigators completed their examination. That complicated later reconstruction efforts. Crime scene investigators documented the evidence that remained: fibers, footwear impressions, fingerprints, biological evidence. Every item was collected with the hope that science might eventually provide answers. The autopsy established several key findings. The medical examiner concluded that JonBenét died from asphyxia associated with a head injury. Evidence of prior sexual assault was also documented. Investigators intentionally withheld certain details from public release, believing that preserving undisclosed information might someday help distinguish genuine confessions from false ones. As the forensic examination continued, another discovery drew attention. Unidentified male DNA was detected in samples collected during the investigation. Over the years, that DNA would become one of the most debated aspects of the case. Its interpretation, however, has never been straightforward. Investigators have cautioned that the presence of DNA does not automatically identify the killer. Modern forensic science recognizes that trace DNA can sometimes be transferred indirectly through innocent contact or manufacturing processes. Whether the unidentified DNA belongs to the perpetrator remains unresolved. For that reason, authorities have continued treating it as important evidence while avoiding conclusions that exceed what the science can currently prove. Meanwhile, detectives began reconstructing the family's movements during Christmas Day. Witnesses confirmed that the Ramseys had attended a holiday gathering before returning home that evening. Investigators interviewed family members, friends, neighbors, and anyone who had interacted with the Ramseys during the days leading up to Christmas. John and Patsy Ramsey eventually participated in interviews with investigators, although disagreements later emerged regarding the timing and conditions under which those interviews occurred. Those disagreements became part of the broader public discussion surrounding the investigation. For detectives, however, interviews represented only one piece of the puzzle. Evidence, not public opinion, would determine where the investigation led. As media coverage intensified, public attention increasingly focused on the Ramsey family. Television programs analyzed photographs. Newspapers published daily updates. Speculation spread rapidly. The distinction between verified facts and public theories became increasingly blurred. Investigators repeatedly emphasized that no conclusions should be drawn without evidence. Yet the unprecedented level of media attention created enormous pressure on everyone involved. The Boulder Police Department found itself conducting a homicide investigation under the constant scrutiny of national television cameras. Every development became headline news. Every rumor found an audience. For JonBenét's family, grief unfolded alongside worldwide speculation. As months passed, detectives continued examining physical evidence while pursuing numerous investigative leads. Individuals connected to the family were interviewed. People living nearby were interviewed. Tips arrived from across the country. Many appeared promising at first. Most were eventually ruled out. The investigation remained active, but an arrest never came. Investigators examined the ransom note, forensic evidence, and countless interviews, yet the trail still led to no criminal charges. What part of the evidence do you believe investigators found most difficult to interpret? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments, remembering that the case remains officially unsolved. Time did not reduce interest in JonBenét's murder. If anything, it increased it. Books were published. Television documentaries revisited the evidence. Retired investigators offered opinions. Independent experts proposed competing theories. Some focused on the ransom note. Others emphasized forensic evidence. Still others argued that investigators had overlooked critical opportunities during the first day of the investigation. Through it all, one fact remained unchanged. No court has determined who killed JonBenét Ramsey. The official investigation continued, and the search for answers entered its next chapter. As weeks turned into months, investigators found themselves confronting a reality familiar to many major homicide cases. The passage of time does not always bring clarity. Sometimes it brings more questions. The Boulder Police Department continued to review evidence, conduct interviews, and pursue new leads, but no single piece of evidence definitively identified the person responsible for JonBenét's murder. For the Ramsey family, life would never return to what it had been before Christmas 1996. They had buried their daughter while simultaneously becoming the focus of one of the most publicized criminal investigations in American history. Every public appearance, every interview, every legal filing, every investigative update, each became front-page news. In the years following JonBenét's death, the investigation expanded far beyond Boulder. Thousands of tips poured in from across the United States and overseas. Some came from people convinced they had witnessed suspicious behavior. Others claimed to possess insider knowledge. Many were investigated. Most ultimately led nowhere. Cold case detectives often describe homicide investigations as assembling a puzzle without knowing whether every piece is still in the box. The Ramsey case became exactly that. Some pieces seemed to fit. Others contradicted each other. None completed the picture. As investigators continued reviewing the physical evidence, forensic science itself was changing. The late 1990s and early 2000s saw significant advances in DNA analysis. Evidence that once produced only partial information could now be examined using more sensitive techniques. Recognizing those developments, investigators submitted items from the Ramsey case for additional testing as technology improved. Among the most closely watched pieces of evidence remained the unidentified male DNA profile recovered during the investigation. In 2003, additional laboratory testing helped develop a more complete DNA profile from previously collected evidence. That profile was eventually entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as CODIS. The hope was straightforward. If the individual responsible had previously submitted DNA through another criminal investigation, the database might identify them. No match was found. The absence of a match did not eliminate the importance of the evidence. It simply meant that no qualifying DNA profile in the database matched the one recovered from the case. For investigators, that left the question unanswered. Who did the DNA belong to? And was it connected to JonBenét's murder? Those questions remain active today. One of the most significant public developments came in 2008. After reviewing the available DNA evidence, then Boulder County District Attorney Mary Lacey sent a public letter stating that the Ramsey family should be considered cleared based upon the DNA evidence available at that time. The letter received widespread media attention. However, years later, subsequent prosecutors clarified that the investigation remained open and that no official declaration had permanently resolved every investigative question. That distinction became important. A prosecutor's public statement reflected an interpretation of available evidence. It did not end the homicide investigation, nor did it identify the killer. The case remained unsolved. Meanwhile, another chapter of the investigation had unfolded largely outside public view. In 1998, a Boulder County grand jury began reviewing evidence related to JonBenét's death. Grand juries operate differently from criminal trials. Their role is not to determine guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, they evaluate whether sufficient evidence exists to support criminal charges. The proceedings remained secret. For years, the public knew only that no indictment had been announced. Then, in 2013, previously sealed court records revealed an important fact. The grand jury had voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges related to child abuse, resulting in death, and allegedly permitting a child to be placed in a situation posing a threat of injury. Importantly, those indictments were never signed or prosecuted by the district attorney at the time, Alex Hunter. He concluded that the available evidence was insufficient to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. As a result, no criminal charges were ever filed. Under the American legal system, an indictment that is not pursued does not establish guilt. Neither John nor Patsy Ramsey was ever convicted of any crime related to JonBenét's death, and both consistently maintained their innocence. That distinction remains essential when discussing the case. Public suspicion is not the same as legal proof. Evidence presented during a grand jury review is not equivalent to a criminal conviction. The burden of proof in court remains extraordinarily high. For nearly 30 years, no prosecutor has brought homicide charges against any individual. That fact alone illustrates how extraordinarily difficult this investigation has been. For nearly 3 decades, JonBenét Ramsey's family has lived without a final answer. If you've ever watched a family wait years for justice in a case that remained unresolved, you understand how time can deepen grief rather than erase it. Those stories deserve to be remembered. As the years passed, public fascination with the case never disappeared. Documentaries revisited old evidence. Books argued competing theories. Television specials often presented dramatically different interpretations of the same facts. Investigators repeatedly cautioned against confusing speculation with evidence. The difference mattered. One could influence public opinion. Only the other could solve a homicide. Advances in forensic science continued. Touch DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Genealogical DNA techniques solved numerous cold cases across the United States. Investigators in Boulder acknowledged these technological developments and periodically reviewed whether additional testing might produce new information. In recent years, Boulder police have publicly stated that the evidence continues to undergo evaluation using the most advanced forensic methods available whenever appropriate. The investigation remains active. That single fact continues to distinguish JonBenét Ramsey's case from history. It has not been forgotten. It has not been closed. It is still waiting. We're about to reach the latest chapter in JonBenét Ramsey's case. With advances like forensic genealogy solving decades-old murders across the country, what do you think could finally unlock this investigation? Share your thoughts before we continue. The hope that began on a cold December morning has changed over the years. It is no longer the hope of an immediate arrest. Instead, it is the hope that science, persistence, and time may eventually accomplish what investigators could not in 1996. The passage of time has a way of changing almost everything. Neighborhoods grow, families move, investigators retire, technology advances. But for the family of a murdered child, time rarely answers the question that matters most. Who did it? Nearly 30 years after JonBenét Ramsey's death, that question still defines one of America's most closely watched homicide investigations. Although the investigation has never officially closed, it has evolved. Today, detectives continue working alongside forensic specialists to evaluate evidence collected in 1996 using technologies that simply did not exist when JonBenét was killed. The Boulder Police Department has repeatedly stated that the case remains an active homicide investigation. Officials have also confirmed that evidence continues to be reviewed whenever new forensic methods become available. One of the most discussed possibilities in recent years has been investigative genetic genealogy. This technique has helped solve numerous cold cases across the United States by identifying unknown individuals through DNA relationships, rather than direct database matches. Cases once considered impossible have been solved decades later using this approach. Because of those successes, many people have wondered whether the same technology could eventually identify the person connected to the unidentified DNA profile in JonBenét's case. Authorities have acknowledged public interest in additional testing, but investigators have not announced that forensic genealogy has identified a suspect. As of today, no individual has been charged with JonBenét Ramsey's murder. That distinction remains one of the most important facts in the entire case. For nearly 3 decades, countless theories have circulated. Some have focused on an unknown intruder. Others have centered on members of the Ramsey family. Still others have proposed explanations involving individuals who were investigated and later excluded. But theories, even popular ones, are not evidence. The responsibility of investigators is not to prove the most discussed explanation. It is to prove the correct one. And proving a homicide case in court requires evidence capable of surviving rigorous legal scrutiny. Throughout the years, Jon Ramsey has continued speaking publicly about his daughter's case. He has repeatedly urged investigators to pursue the most advanced DNA testing available and has expressed hope that modern forensic science will eventually identify the person responsible. His requests reflect a broader reality shared by many families whose loved ones' cases remain unsolved. Technology continues moving forward. Hope moves with it. The Boulder Police Department has also reaffirmed its commitment to the investigation. Officials have stated that they continue collaborating with state and federal forensic experts and reviewing evidence whenever new scientific methods become available. Cold cases rarely end because investigators stop caring. More often, they remain open because the evidence has not yet reached the threshold required to identify and successfully prosecute the offender. That is the challenge facing detectives today. Not simply finding a name, finding proof. Proof that can withstand cross-examination. Proof that leads not merely to an arrest, but to justice. For the public, JonBenét Ramsey's case has become more than a headline. It has become a reminder of how fragile certainty can be. Despite thousands of pages of reports, years of forensic testing, a grand jury, national media attention, and decades of public discussion, the central mystery remains unresolved. History shows that some cold cases are solved after 30 years, others after 40, some after half a century. Each resolution begins with one new piece of evidence, one overlooked detail, one witness willing to speak, or one scientific breakthrough. That possibility still exists here, because this case has never been closed. Every item preserved in evidence remains capable of being re-examined. Every advancement in forensic science creates another opportunity. Every passing year brings tools investigators never had before. For JonBenét's memory, those possibilities matter. It is easy for public attention to focus on controversy, on headlines, on competing theories. But beneath every discussion is a 6-year-old child whose life ended far too soon. She should be remembered not because the case became famous, but because she mattered. She was a daughter, a sister, a classmate, a child excited for Christmas. Those truths have never changed. Neither has the responsibility to seek answers. If someone somewhere possesses information that has never been shared with investigators, that information could still matter today. Even after nearly 3 decades, even after countless interviews, cold cases have been solved because someone finally decided that the time for silence had ended. Perhaps that day will come for JonBenét Ramsey. Perhaps the answer already exists inside evidence, waiting for technology to catch up. Or perhaps the one person who knows the truth has yet to speak. Until that happens, the investigation continues. The questions remain, and JonBenét's name endures, not as a mystery to be debated, but as a child whose story deserves to be remembered with dignity and care. If you have information related to the murder of JonBenét Ramsey, the Boulder Police Department asks that you contact investigators through their official tip channels. Every piece of credible information is evaluated, because even after nearly 30 years, every case deserves an answer. Every family deserves the truth. If you believe in telling the stories of victims who deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing to the Silence Evidence. Together, we can help ensure these cases are never forgotten.